signaling with red lights, blinking code. There are 4 fires on the shore, looking like pinpoints, winking, smudged by smoke. Now planes are going overhead.
World War II began with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. This was followed by a later full-scale invasion of China in 1937. This forced the Chinese communists and nationalists, who were at the time fighting a civil war, to join forces to help combat the Japanese. The invasion of China was very brutal. The Japanese believed that they were the superior race and showed that in their treatment of the Chinese civilians. The event that best characterizes the treatment of Chinese civilians is the rape of Nanking in 1937. And in 1940, the Japanese signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, which made all 3 of them allies. Italian aggression. The Italian people suffered greatly during World War I, and they were left in economic ruin following World War I. Italy also did not receive the territorial gain that they felt they should have received following the Paris Peace Conference, so they were pretty upset. They felt wronged. Dictator Benito Mussolini, he rose to power in the 1920s and promised he would return Italy to its former glory of Rome. Italy would then conquer Ethiopia and annex Libya in 1935. He would also later annex Albania in 1939, and he supported General Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. German aggression. Germany had a bitter resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles. Germany's economy was in a severe depression, and their military had been stripped down, basically taken away from them. Following Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, they immediately began to build up Germany's military. He would militarize an area known as the Rhineland, annex Austria in 1938, then took the Sudetenland. British and French governments attempted to negotiate peace through appeasement following Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland at the Munich Conference. Following the meeting between Hitler and the 2 nations, Germany went ahead anyway and invaded Czechoslovakia. Germany would also sign the agreed on a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1939. The Germans stunned the world using their new battle tactic Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And doing this allowed Germany to utterly dominate the Allies in the early stages of the war. France and Britain would formally declare war on Germany following the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. The Germans quickly swept through most of Europe, and they took France in just 6 weeks. This left Britain all alone and led to the Battle of Britain in 1940, which was, at that time, Britain's last stand against Germany. By 1941, Germany also controlled North Africa and the Balkans. Then in 1941, Germany would make the ill-fated decision to invade the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, and this would prove very, very costly for Germany. Battles in Asia and the Pacific. During the early stages of the war, the United States supplied the Allies with weapons and supplies. As Japan pushed further into Southeast Asia, the United States placed an embargo on oil, so Japan lost basically most of its oil. This prompted Japan to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This was to cripple the United States Navy. The United States would declare war on Japan the next day, and then Germany would also later declare war on the United States. Following the surprise attack, Japan would swiftly push through Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Indochina, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The defeat of the Axis powers. So the entry of both the United States and the Soviet Union in 1941 proved pivotal, turning the tides of war in the Allies' favor. Following a defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, the Soviets began pushing back the Germans on the Eastern Front. In 1944, the Allies were able to kick the Germans out of North Africa. In June of 1944, the Allies invaded France, which was D-Day, with the British and the Americans closing in on the West, and the Soviets already in Berlin. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, and the Germans would later surrender on May 8th of 1945. Japan. So the turning point for the Allies in the Pacific theater was the Battle of Midway in 1942, which the Japanese never recovered from. The U.S. began an island-hopping campaign to get closer to the Japanese mainland. The closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more fierce and brutal the fighting became. This was most evident on the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. As the U.S. got closer to the mainland, they began bombing Japanese cities. The most devastating of these air raids was the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945, which killed an estimated 100,000 people. Eventually, the U.S. would use the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. And following the nuclear bombing, the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan and force a Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945, marking the end of World War II.
Occupation, collaboration, and resistance. Japanese set up puppet governments in their occupied territories. The Germans believed they had racial superiority and had strict German supervision over all civilian states. German and Japanese would both conquer and utilize countries, people, and resources through slave labor from the Soviets and Balkans and other. Resistances formed and would come in active and passive forms. Refusal to give in, fighting back, and assassination were all forms that were used. The Axis powers committed atrocities upon any form of resistance, passive or aggressive. Rebellions would continue throughout the duration of the war. The Holocaust. Deep-rooted anti-Semitism in newly Nazi-occupied areas made it easier for the oppression of the Jewish population to spread, as well as the Nazi ideology. Following Nazi torture on the Jewish population of Europe, the Nazis created a plan to more effectively slaughter a higher number of Jewish people, as well as the people seen as racially inferior, called the Final Solution. In 1942, forced relocation of the Jewish population to concentration camps in Poland, globally known, Auschwitz alone saw over 1 million casualties. Jewish will to protest/fight back was heavily diminished after cruelty and war crimes committed upon them. But in 1943, a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw famously displayed a successful retaliation. By the end of the Holocaust, the Jewish population alone took around 5.5 million casualties. Women and the war. In most countries during the war, women saw a significant increase in responsibility, supporting roles, and could even lead families at the time. For example, 350,000 American women would join and assist in war efforts. Women would gain greater self-confidence and would ultimately benefit socially, but following the war, the status of women would sink once again. The Japanese during the war would create an identity for most Korean and Chinese captive women as comfort women, but were forced into sexual practices for brothels and would practically become enslaved. Many of the women that were made comfort women were murdered by the Japanese soldiers. Post-war settlements and Cold War. Following the war, the two global powers were the United States and the Soviet Union, and they both were actively searching for neutral nations to gain influence over in Europe. 60 million total casualties came following World War II. The remaining German forces fled west out of fear of the advancing Soviet Union. A combined total of 15 million prisoners of war were freed from where they had been imprisoned. Relationship among the Allies quickly became strained, specifically between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Americans were fearful of the communist influence that could potentially fall over Eastern Europe. Settlements were agreed upon by the Allied forces, and the sum of the former German lands became split to Eastern Germany, taken by the Soviets, and Western Germany, taken by the U.S., British, and the French. Territorial bouts over divisions of territory became an increasingly growing problem and grew tension between the U.S. and the Soviets. Stalin had taken most of Eastern Europe under the communist identity. The Berlin territory was also split 4 ways into different spheres of influence among the victorious nations. The Iron Curtain was the phrase coined by Winston Churchill to describe the Soviet separation of Eastern and Western Europe. Korea was also divided into the North Soviet-controlled and the South American-controlled territories. The Truman Doctrine was developed as an American policy that would aid any country under communist threat. The interventionist policy was created later to contain communism. Global Reconstruction and the United Nations. In 1949, the Marshall Plan went into effect, which gave Western European countries a total of $13 billion in relief to rebuild post-war Europe and the secondary goal of promoting capitalism in Europe. In response, the Soviets created Comecon, offering economic and trade support for those countries in the Soviet Union. NATO was created in 1949 by the United States to act as a military alliance of Western European countries against the Soviet Union. The Soviets would create their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact in 1955, consisting of Eastern Bloc countries. The United Nations was established in 1945 to act as an international organization that was responsible for keeping world peace and preventing further wars.